January 19th, 1931. A Monday evening in Liverpool, England. At precisely 7:15 p.m., the telephone rings at the Cottle's Cafe, a small establishment that doubles as the meeting place for the Liverpool Central Chess Club. The caller's voice is calm, measured, almost rehearsed. He asks to speak with William Herbert Wallace, a 52-year-old insurance agent known for his methodical nature and passion for chess. But Wallace hasn't arrived yet. The caller leaves a message that will set in motion one of the most perplexing murder cases in British criminal history. A message that seems designed not to deliver information, but to create an alibi for the impossible. The man on the telephone identifies himself as R.M. Qualtrough. He needs to speak with Mr. Wallace about an insurance matter, he explains. Urgent business. Could Mr. Wallace visit him at his home the following evening? The address, 25, Menlove Gardens East, Liverpool. Time, 7:30 p.m. Samuel Beattie, the club captain who takes the call, writes down every detail. There's something odd about the caller's voice, slightly muffled, perhaps disguised. But in 1931 Liverpool, a city still recovering from the Great Depression, insurance business is insurance business. Beattie promises to relay the message. When William Wallace arrives at the chess club 20 minutes later, Beattie delivers the mysterious appointment. Wallace seems puzzled. He doesn't recognize the name Qualtrough. He's never heard of Menlove Gardens East, though he knows the general area. But a potential client is a potential client, and Wallace, ever the dutiful insurance agent, accepts the engagement. He plays his scheduled chess match that evening, loses, actually, and returns home to 29, Wolverton Street, a narrow Victorian terraced house in the Anfield district, where his wife Julia awaits. He mentions the appointment. She helps him locate the approximate area on a street map. They plan for tomorrow's visit. Everything seems routine, unremarkable, utterly ordinary. What Wallace doesn't know, what he cannot possibly know, is that there is no R.M. Qualtrough. There is number 25 Menlove Gardens East. The address doesn't exist. Never has. And in less than 24 hours, his wife will be dead, her skull crushed by 11 savage blows from a weapon never found, in a crime scene so bizarre that it will baffle forensic experts for generations. The next evening, January 20th, Wallace leaves his home at 6:45 p.m., giving himself plenty of time to navigate across Liverpool to this mysterious Menlove Gardens East. Julia walks him to the back door, the couple's usual farewell ritual. She's wearing a light-colored skirt and a dark cardigan. Her hair is neatly arranged. She's 69 years old, frail from chronic kidney disease, but her mind is sharp. The house is warm, the gas fire burning in the parlor. Wallace steps into the cold January night, umbrella in hand, and begins what will become the most scrutinized journey in British legal history. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. Wallace's odyssey across Liverpool is meticulously documented, almost suspiciously so. He takes a tram at 7:06 p.m. The conductor remembers him. He asks multiple people for directions to Menlove Gardens East. A police constable at 7:45 p.m. Several residents in the Menlove Gardens area. He finds Menlove Gardens North, Menlove Gardens South, Menlove Gardens West, but no Menlove Gardens East. He knocks on doors. He inquires at a newsagent's shop at 25, Menlove Gardens West. Perhaps there's been a mistake with the address number? The proprietor, Katie Mather, notes the time, approximately 8:05 p.m. Wallace seems genuinely confused, increasingly frustrated. He's been sent on a wild goose chase. By 8:45 p.m., Wallace gives up. The appointment is clearly a hoax, a waste of his evening. He boards a tram back toward Anfield, arriving home shortly before 9 p.m. He tries the front door, locked. He tries the back door, also locked. Strange. Julia should be home. He notices the neighbors, John and Florence Johnston, returning from an evening out. Come and see. Wallace calls to them. My wife doesn't answer. There's confusion in his voice, perhaps the first hint of dread. John Johnston accompanies Wallace around to the back door. This time, when Wallace tries it, the door opens. Had it been locked before? Wallace isn't certain. They enter through the back kitchen. The house is dark, silent. Julia, Wallace calls out. No response. They move through the house, switching on lights. The middle room, nothing. The front parlor door is closed. Wallace pushes it open. The scene that greets them is the stuff of nightmares carefully arranged. Julia Wallace lies face down on the hearth rug, her body positioned diagonally across it, her head toward the gas fire. Blood pools beneath her, soaking into the rug, splattered across the furniture, sprayed onto the walls in arcs that speak of incredible violence. Her skull has been shattered. The left side of her head is a mass of wounds, bone fragments, brain matter. The weapon, whatever it was, had been wielded with extreme force, again and again and again. 11 separate impacts, the autopsy will later reveal. Yet despite this carnage, despite the arterial spray pattern indicating her heart was still beating during the attack, something is deeply, disturbingly wrong with this crime scene. The gas fire is still burning, creating an eerie, warm glow over the corpse. Julia's skirt has been pulled up, arranged almost modestly to expose only her lower legs, as if someone wanted to suggest a sexual motive without actually committing sexual assault. But nothing else in the room indicates robbery or sexual violence. The room itself is strangely tidy except for the body and blood. A Macintosh raincoat, Wallace's own, he'll later identify, lies bunched up beneath Julia's body, burned at the edges where it touched the gas fire. Why would Julia be lying on her husband's raincoat? Why would an intruder use it? The questions multiply with every detail. John Johnston, a practical man not given to panic, nevertheless feels the cold finger of horror traced down his spine. "Don't touch anything," he tells Wallace. "I'll fetch the police." As Johnston hurries out into the night, William Wallace stands in the doorway of his parlor, staring at his wife's broken body. His face, Johnston will later testify, shows shock, but not the wild grief one might expect. He seems stunned, disbelieving, processing the impossible. The police arrive within minutes. Constable Fred Williams at 9:10 p.m., followed shortly by detectives and the police surgeon. They find Wallace sitting in the kitchen, his head in his hands. The house is searched. Nothing appears to be stolen from upstairs. No signs of forced entry. In the front parlor, where Julia's body lies, they discover that a cabinet has been wrenched open, and approximately £4 in cash, Wallace's insurance collection money, is missing from a cash box that's been removed and replaced. But here's the peculiarity. The intruder would have had to ask Julia where the money was kept, or known the Wallace household intimately. The hiding place wasn't obvious. Professor John Macfall, the police surgeon, arrives at 9:50 p.m. He examines Julia's body, still lying where she fell. He estimates, and this estimation will become crucial, that death occurred approximately 4 hours earlier, around 6 p.m. But estimates of time of death in 1931 are inexact sciences, based on body temperature, rigor mortis, stomach contents. Macfall is confident, but confidence isn't the same as certainty. If he's right, Julia died while Wallace was at home, preparing to leave for his appointment. If he's wrong by even 30 minutes, everything changes. The detectives study Wallace carefully. He's cooperative, almost overly so. He provides a detailed account of his evening, his fruitless search for the non-existent address, the names of everyone he spoke to, the times he can remember. He explains the telephone call from the previous evening, the mysterious Qualtro. He seems confused about the back door. Was it locked or wasn't it? He can't be certain. The detectives exchange glances. This level of detail, this precision of memory, seems almost rehearsed. Or is it simply the methodical mind of an insurance agent, trained to document everything? As midnight approaches, Julia Wallace's body is finally removed from 29 Wolverton Street. The blood-soaked hearth rug is rolled up for evidence. The Macintosh is bagged. The house falls silent except for the ticking of the clock in the hall, each second marking time in a mystery that defies every rule of logical deduction. Because if Professor Macfall's timeline is correct, William Herbert Wallace has the perfect alibi. He was across the city, witnessed by dozens of people, searching for an address that doesn't exist. He couldn't have killed his wife. But if he didn't kill her, then who did? And how did the killer know Wallace would be gone? How did they gain entry without forcing doors or windows? How did they convince the frail, cautious Julia to let them into her home and turn her back on them in the parlor? And most haunting of all, if Wallace created this elaborate ruse himself, how did he manage to murder his wife, clean himself of blood, hide the weapon, stage the scene, and travel across Liverpool to establish his alibi, all within a time frame that seems physically impossible? The investigation has barely begun, But already the Liverpool City Police face a case that breaks every rule. No confession, no obvious motive, no murder weapon, no witnesses, just a dead woman, a suspicious husband with an ironclad alibi, and a phantom caller named Qualtro who summoned a man away from his home the very night murder came calling. The clock that night didn't just tick, it mocked, because time itself had become a weapon in the hands of either a brilliant killer or the cruelest coincidence in criminal history. The morning of January 21st, 1931, dawns cold and gray over Liverpool, but the chill inside 29, Wolverton Street, has nothing to do with the weather. Detective Superintendent Hubert Moore stands in the front parlor where Julia Wallace died, studying the room with the intensity of a man who knows he's looking at something that doesn't add up. The blood has dried to a dark brown crust on the walls, the furniture, the floor. The gas fire has been extinguished. In the harsh light of day, the crime scene reveals its secrets and deepens its mysteries in equal measure. Moore is a veteran investigator, a man who has seen his share of domestic murders, and they usually follow predictable patterns. Crimes of passion are messy, chaotic, emotional. The killer strikes in rage, leaves evidence everywhere, often confesses within hours once the fury subsides. But this is something else entirely. The violence was extreme. 11 crushing blows to Julia's skull. Yet the scene shows signs of careful staging. The room wasn't ransacked. Ornaments remain on shelves. Only the cabinet where the cash box was kept shows disturbance. It's as if the killer had a specific agenda and deviated from it only to deliver death. Moore walks through the sequence again, reconstructing. The parlor was a room the Wallaces rarely used. It was kept for special occasions, guests, formality. The couple normally spent their evenings in the middle room, warmer and more comfortable. So why was Julia in the parlor that night? The gas fire was lit, suggesting she was expecting to be there for some time. Had she been entertaining someone? The teacups in the kitchen show that she'd had her evening tea, but nothing suggests a visitor. Unless that visitor was someone she trusted completely, someone who wouldn't require the formality of tea. The murder weapon remains the investigation's greatest frustration. Professor Macfall has determined that the wounds were caused by something heavy and blunt, wielded with tremendous force. An iron bar perhaps, or a heavy poker. The Wallace's own fireplace poker shows no signs of blood or recent cleaning. Every potential weapon in the house has been examined, negative. The killer either brought the weapon with them and took it away, or disposed of it so thoroughly that it has vanished without trace. Moore's men have searched the drains, the nearby alleys, the gardens along Wolverton Street. Nothing. Then there's the matter of blood, or rather, the lack of it where it should be. With the arterial spray patterns on the walls and furniture, the killer must have been covered in it. Yet there's no trail of blood leading from the parlor. No bloody handprints on doorknobs. No drops leading to the back door. The bathroom shows no signs of hasty washing. How does someone commit such a brutal murder and walk away clean? The only explanation is that the killer wore protective clothing. But what? The Macintosh found under Julia's body, perhaps? It belonged to William Wallace, kept hanging in the hall. Had the killer worn it during the attack, then placed it beneath her body? But why? Detective Sergeant Harry Bailey, Moore's right hand in the investigation, presents another troubling detail. The crime scene appears to have been staged to suggest robbery, but the staging is clumsy, almost perfunctory. £4 is missing from the cash box, a modest sum, hardly worth murder. Yet upstairs, in plain view in the bedroom, sits Julia's handbag containing several pounds more. An opportunistic thief would have taken it. A desperate robber would have searched more thoroughly. The missing money feels like an afterthought, a weak attempt to provide motive where none organically exists. Moore turns his attention to the timeline, the spine of any murder investigation. Professor Macfall has placed time of death at approximately 6 o'clock in the evening. Give or take 30 minutes. William Wallace left the house at 6:45 p.m., witnessed by multiple neighbors who saw him departing, umbrella in hand, catching the tram shortly after 7. If Macfall is correct, Julia was already dead or dying when her husband walked out the door. But can Macfall be certain? The science of determining time of death is imprecise, dependent on variables: room temperature, the victim's metabolism, the temperature of the body when first examined. Macfall examined Julia at 9:50 p.m., nearly 4 hours after Wallace claims to have left. That's a significant window for error. The alternative timeline is damning. If Julia died after 6:45 p.m., say, at 7 o'clock or 7:15, then Wallace would have had time to commit the murder, clean up rapidly, and still make his tram. But the witnesses place him on that tram at 7:06 p.m. The journey from Wolverton Street to the tram stop takes approximately 8 to 10 minutes at a brisk walk. That would mean Wallace had, at most, 10 minutes to murder his wife with 11 crushing blows, arrange her body, stage the robbery, dispose of or hide the weapon, clean himself of blood, compose himself sufficiently to appear normal to the tram conductor, and board that tram. 10 minutes. It's theoretically possible, but only just. And it requires a level of cold-blooded calculation that seems at odds with the frenzied violence of the murder itself. Moore interviews the neighbors systematically. The Johnstons, who accompanied Wallace when he discovered the body, describe his demeanor as shocked but controlled. Not the wild grief one might expect, but then people process trauma differently. Some scream. Some go silent. Some, like Wallace, seem to retreat into a kind of analytical detachment. The Johnstons heard nothing unusual that evening. No screams, no sounds of struggle. The walls between these terraced houses are thin. Surely someone would have heard something? But wait. At approximately 6:30 p.m., a neighbor named John Sharp Johnston, no relation to the Johnstons who discovered the body, heard a faint thud from the direction of the Wallace home. Just one thud, nothing more. He thought little of it at the time. Could that have been the sound of Julia's body falling? If so, it places the murder at 6:30 p.m., precisely 15 minutes before Wallace says he left the house. The time frame grows even tighter, even more impossible. Moore conducts his first formal interview with William Herbert Wallace on January 22nd. Wallace arrives at the police station punctually, dressed in his customary neat dark suit, his manner cooperative and precise. He's a slight man, bookish, with wire-rimmed spectacles and thinning hair. He speaks in measured tones, the voice of someone accustomed to explaining insurance policies to skeptical clients. There's no visible nervousness, no stammering or evasion. He answers every question with methodical detail. Wallace explains his marriage. He and Julia had been together for 18 years, married late in life. He was 35. She was 52 when they wed. No children. Julia's health had been declining, her kidney disease causing her frequent pain, but their relationship was, by his account, affectionate and stable. No fights, no affairs, no money troubles beyond the ordinary struggles of the working class. He loved her, he says, with a simplicity that could be either genuine grief or masterful performance. Regarding the mysterious telephone call, Wallace's story remains consistent. He didn't recognize the name Qualtrough. He'd never heard it before in his life. The address meant nothing to him. Though he knew the Menlove Gardens area existed, he had no reason to suspect a hoax. Insurance agents follow up on every lead. That's the nature of the business. His search for 25 Menlove Gardens East was genuine, thorough, and witnessed by multiple people who will later testify to his apparent confusion and frustration. Moore presses him on the details of that evening. The locked doors, the Macintosh, the cash box. Wallace's answers are consistent but troubling in their precision. Yes, he tried both doors and found them locked initially. No, he can't explain why the back door opened when he tried it a second time with Johnston present. Perhaps he'd been mistaken in his distressed state. The Macintosh puzzles him. Why would Julia have taken it down from the hall? Why would it be in the parlor? The missing money troubles him less than Moore would expect. For pounds isn't worth killing for, Wallace says reasonably. Surely a genuine robber would have searched more thoroughly? It's this reasonableness that begins to harden Moore's suspicion. Wallace is too controlled, too analytical, too quick with logical explanations. Where is the emotion? Where is the rage at whoever did this to his wife? Where is the desperate insistence on his innocence? Instead, Wallace treats the interview like an insurance assessment, weighing evidence, considering possibilities, speaking of his wife's murder as if it's a problem to be solved rather than a wound that should be bleeding him dry. Moore's team digs deeper into Wallace's background. He's not native to Liverpool. He grew up in the Lake District, worked various jobs before settling into insurance. He's educated beyond his station, self-taught in mathematics, science, languages. He plays violin, studies chemistry, debates philosophy at the chess club. His colleagues at the Prudential Insurance Company describe him as meticulous, punctual, perhaps a bit cold, but honest and hard-working. No gambling debts. No secret vices. No suspicious associations. He's almost aggressively ordinary. A gray man living a gray life in a gray city. But Moore knows that monsters often wear ordinary faces. He authorizes around-the-clock surveillance of Wallace. Detectives shadow him to work, watch his house at night, note everyone he speaks with. Wallace seems aware of the surveillance and unbothered by it. He maintains his routine: work, home, chess club. He visits Julia's sister, Amy Wallace, and appears appropriately mournful. He makes arrangements for the funeral. He tells friends he's confident the police will find the real killer. That confidence itself feels suspicious. An innocent man should be terrified, paranoid, demanding action. Wallace is merely patient. On January 26th, the Liverpool City Police make the decision that will define the case. Based on the impossibility of anyone else gaining entry to the house, the suspicious timing, the lack of any credible alternative suspect, and the increasingly theatrical quality of Wallace's alibi, Superintendent Moore obtains a warrant. That evening, as William Herbert Wallace sits in his parlor, no longer the murder scene, but still haunted by Julia's ghost, two detectives knock on his door. "Mr. Wallace, I'm arresting you for the willful murder of your wife, Julia Wallace, on the night of January 20th, 1931. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence." Wallace stands, his face registering what might be shock, or might be the performance of shock. "What can I say to this charge?" he asks, his voice level. "Of which I am absolutely innocent." It's phrased as a question, but delivered as a statement. Even in arrest, Wallace maintains his peculiar composure, this studied calm that reads as either the innocence of a man falsely accused or the confidence of a killer who believes he's committed the perfect crime. As the detectives lead him out of 29 Wolverton Street in handcuffs, neighbors gather on the pavement, whispering, pointing. The quiet insurance agent who played chess and kept to himself is now the prime suspect in one of Liverpool's most brutal murders. The newspapers will have a field day. But Moore knows that arresting Wallace is the easy part, proving he killed his wife when he appears to have been miles away at the time of her death. That's the impossible equation they must somehow solve, because the evidence points in two directions simultaneously. Everything suggests Wallace is guilty. Nothing proves he could have done it. And in that contradiction lies either the most brilliant murder plot in British criminal history or the most catastrophic miscarriage of justice about to unfold. The house at 29 Wolverton Street stands empty now, both its occupants gone. One to the grave, one to the cells. The bloodstains remain on the parlor walls, testimony to violence that still demands explanation. And somewhere in Liverpool, if Wallace is innocent, a killer walks free, having committed murder so perfectly staged that the wrong man may hang for it. The case against William Herbert Wallace should be simple. A man's wife is murdered in their home. No signs of forced entry. Nothing of significant value stolen. The husband stands to gain from her death a modest insurance policy, freedom from a marriage that may have grown stale. He has the means, the opportunity, and perhaps the motive. In 90% of domestic murders, the spouse is guilty. Except in this case, the spouse has an alibi that's either genuinely ironclad or so brilliantly constructed that it borders on genius. As Wallace sits in Walton Prison awaiting trial, his solicitor, Hector Munro, begins assembling a defense that rests on one fundamental question. How could Wallace have made that telephone call on January 19th when he was at the chess club? How could he have murdered Julia, disposed of evidence, and traveled across Liverpool in the impossibly narrow window of time available? How could he have known the address he invented, 25 Menlove Gardens East, didn't actually exist? The prosecution must prove not just that Wallace wanted his wife dead, but that he possessed the superhuman ability to be in two places at once. The telephone call becomes the cornerstone of both prosecution and defense strategies. At 7:15 p.m. on January 19th, someone called the chess club asking for Wallace. The Liverpool Telephone Exchange records confirm a call was made from a public call box at 7:15 p.m., located at the corner of Rochester Road and Breck Road, approximately 400 yards from Wallace's home. The prosecution will argue Wallace made this call himself, disguising his voice, then rushed to the chess club to establish he wasn't near a telephone when the message was delivered. But the timeline presents problems. Hector Munro commissions his own investigation. His researchers walk the route from the telephone box to the chess club, timing it meticulously. At a brisk pace, the journey takes a minimum of 15 minutes. The call was logged at 7:15 p.m. Samuel Beatty, the chess club captain, testified that Wallace arrived at approximately 7:45 p.m., a 30-minute gap, possible but tight. Wallace would have had to make the call, immediately leave the phone box, and walk rapidly through the dark January streets, arriving slightly breathless, but composed enough that no one at the chess club noticed anything unusual about his demeanor. But here's where the defense finds its weapon. Several chess club members recall Wallace's arrival differently. Depending on whose memory is most accurate, Wallace arrived anywhere between 7:35 and 7:50 p.m. If he arrived at 7:35, he would have had to cover the distance in 20 minutes, possible only if he practically ran. Would a man planning his wife's murder for the following night draw attention to himself by arriving flushed and winded? It seems careless, and Wallace is anything but careless. The prosecution, led by Edward Hemmert, a formidable barrister with a reputation for theatrical courtroom performances, has a different interpretation. Wallace, he will argue, is precisely the kind of methodical personality who would plan every detail. The telephone call was designed to create exactly this confusion, this impossible alibi that would make him seem innocent. Wallace knew the chess club schedule. He knew when to call, so the message would be waiting for him. He invented an address that didn't exist specifically, so he could spend the following evening creating dozens of witnesses to his fruitless search. It's not an alibi, it's an alibi construction kit, assembled with the precision of a watchmaker. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking. As the trial date approaches, the Liverpool newspapers feed a public hungry for sensation. The case has everything: a brutal murder, a mysterious telephone call, a defendant who seems too calm to be innocent but too intelligent to be careless. Public opinion divides sharply. Some see Wallace as a cold-blooded calculator who murdered his ailing wife for insurance money and freedom. Others see him as a tragic figure, an innocent man caught in circumstances so bizarre that they incriminate him through sheer improbability. The trial begins on April 22, 1931, at Liverpool Assizes, presiding Judge Mr. Justice Wright. The courtroom is packed, spectators queuing from early morning for the limited public seats. Wallace enters the dock looking precisely as he always does. Neat dark suit, wire-rimmed spectacles, thinning hair carefully combed. He pleads not guilty in that same measured voice, showing neither fear nor defiance, just a kind of patient resignation to the process. Hemmert opens for the prosecution with a narrative designed to strip away the mystery and reveal a simple domestic murder. Members of the jury, he begins, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed courtroom. The Crown will prove that on the night of January 20th, 1931, William Herbert Wallace murdered his wife in their home at 29 Wolverton Street. He did so for the oldest of motives, financial gain and freedom from an unhappy marriage. What makes this case unusual is not the murder itself, but the elaborate deception Wallace constructed to conceal his guilt. The prosecution's case unfolds systematically. They establish the telephone call, suggesting Wallace made it himself. They present Professor Macfall's testimony regarding time of death, approximately 6 p.m., which would place Julia's murder before Wallace left the house. They emphasize the lack of forced entry, arguing that only Wallace or someone Julia trusted implicitly could have gained access. They highlight the staged quality of the crime scene, the pulled-up skirt suggesting sexual assault without actual assault, the opened cabinet with only a small amount of money missing, the Macintosh placed under the body. But it's Macfall's testimony that becomes the battleground. Under direct examination, he's confident and precise. Based on the body temperature, the degree of rigor mortis, and the state of the stomach contents, I estimate death occurred approximately 4 hours before my examination at 9:50 p.m. That places time of death at approximately 6 p.m., with a margin of error of perhaps 30 minutes either direction. Monroe rises for cross-examination, and the confidence begins to crack. Professor Macfall, you say margin of error of 30 minutes either direction. So death could have occurred as late as 6:30 p.m. Theoretically, yes. And if the room was unusually warm, heated by the gas fire that was burning when the body was discovered, wouldn't that affect the rate of body cooling? Macfall hesitates. It could, yes. So death could have occurred even later? Perhaps 6:45 p.m.? Perhaps even 7 p.m.? I believe my estimate is accurate based on conditions observed. But you cannot swear with absolute certainty that Julia Wallace was dead before her husband left the house at 6:45 p.m., can you? The pause is damning. Not with absolute certainty, no. This admission electrifies the courtroom. If Julia died after Wallace left, then someone else killed her. But who? How did they gain entry? Why was there no sign of forced entry or struggle? The prosecution's timeline is crumbling, but the alternative explanations seem even more improbable. The parade of witnesses follows. The tram conductor who remembers Wallace boarding at 7:06 p.m., noting nothing unusual about his demeanor or appearance. The police constable who gave him directions at 7:45 p.m., observing a man who seemed genuinely confused, not performing confusion. Katie Mather, the newsagent, who spoke with Wallace at her shop at 25 Menlove Gardens West, watching him check the address again and again, seemingly baffled by the non-existent address. Each witness confirms Wallace's journey, his visible frustration, his methodical search for a place that didn't exist. Monroe makes the most of these testimonies. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecution asks you to believe that Mr. Wallace murdered his wife, cleaned himself of blood in minutes, disposed of a murder weapon that has never been found, staged an elaborate crime scene, and then spent 3 hours parading across Liverpool asking dozens of strangers for directions to a non-existent address, all to create this so-called fake alibi. Does this sound like the behavior of a guilty man? Or does it sound like a man who was genuinely sent on a wild goose chase while someone else murdered his wife? But Herbert counters, with devastating logic, in his closing argument. The defense asks, who else could have done this? Who else could have gained entry? Who else would Julia have admitted to her home? Who else knew Wallace would be gone that evening? The answer, members of the jury, is no one. Because no one else made that telephone call but Wallace himself. No one else had reason to lure Wallace away from his home. The alibi is too perfect, too elaborately constructed, too coincidentally timed. Wallace created the mystery to hide behind it. He is not the man who couldn't have done it. He is the only man who could have done it. The testimony that perhaps damages Wallace most has nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with emotion, or the lack of it. Multiple witnesses describe his controlled demeanor when discovering Julia's body, his analytical approach to his wife's murder, his strange composure throughout the investigation and trial. John Johnston testifies that Wallace showed shock, yes, but not the uncontrolled grief one would expect. The implication hangs unspoken but powerful. Innocent people react emotionally. Guilty people perform emotion, and sometimes the performance is too controlled to be genuine. Wallace himself takes the stand, a risky decision but perhaps necessary given the circumstantial nature of the evidence. He speaks clearly, methodically, maintaining his innocence with the same reasonableness that has characterized all his statements. He explains the marriage, comfortable, if not passionate. He describes his love for Julia in practical terms, companionship, mutual support, shared routines. It's not the language of romance, but then Wallace has never been a romantic man. He's an accountant of emotion, measuring and explaining rather than expressing. Did you murder your wife? Herbert asks during cross-examination. No, Wallace replies, meeting the prosecutor's eyes. I did not. Did you make that telephone call on January 19th? No. I was at home with Julia that evening until I left for the chess club. Then who made the call, Mr. Wallace? I don't know. How convenient for you that someone called the chess club, gave a false name and address, lured you across Liverpool at precisely the time your wife was murdered, all without leaving any trace of their identity or motive. How extraordinarily convenient. Wallace's face remains impassive. I cannot explain what I do not understand. I can only tell you the truth. I did not kill my wife. The trial lasts 4 days. The jury retires to deliberate on April 25th at 3:30 p.m. The wait stretches, 1 hour, 2 hours, 3. Long deliberations typically favor the defense, suggesting doubt and disagreement. At 6:30 p.m., after 3 hours of debate, the jury returns. The foreman stands. The courtroom holds its collective breath. Do you find the defendant, William Herbert Wallace, guilty or not guilty of the murder of Julia Wallace? The foreman's voice is clear, final. Guilty. The word detonates in the courtroom. Gasps, murmurs, shouts of disbelief from Wallace's supporters. Wallace himself shows the first crack in his composure. His face pales. His hands grip the dock rail. Mr. Justice, Wright dons the black cap and pronounces the sentence mandated by law: death by hanging. Wallace is led from the dock, no longer a defendant but a condemned man, his impossible alibi judged insufficient to overcome the impossible improbability of anyone else committing this murder. But as Wallace descends to the cells beneath the courthouse, the case is far from over, because even among those who believe in his guilt, a nagging question remains. If Wallace did it, how? The timeline still doesn't quite work. The method still defies explanation. The missing weapon still mocks the prosecution's certainty. And in a legal system built on proof beyond reasonable doubt, perhaps, just perhaps, that doubt is more reasonable than the jury believed. 3 weeks later, Wallace's legal team files an appeal, arguing that the verdict is unsafe, unsupported by evidence, and based more on suspicion than proof. The Court of Criminal Appeal will now decide whether William Herbert Wallace will hang for a murder he may not have committed, or whether he's executed the most brilliant criminal deception in British history and come within a judge's decision of getting away with it. The clock continues ticking, now measuring not just mystery, but the days until a possible execution. And time, which was weapon and alibi both, now becomes executioner or savior. The execution date is set for May 12, 1931. William Herbert Wallace has exactly 17 days to live unless the Court of Criminal Appeal intervenes. In his cell at Walton Prison, Wallace maintains the same eerie composure that characterized his behavior throughout the investigation and trial. He reads philosophy, works on mathematical puzzles, writes letters to supporters protesting his innocence in the same measured prose he might use to explain an insurance policy. The wardens find him unsettling, not because he rages against his fate, but because he seems to accept it with the resignation of a man solving an equation that simply won't balance. Outside the prison walls, however, the Wallace case ignites a firestorm of public controversy unlike anything Britain has seen in decades. The verdict has split the nation cleanly down the middle. Those who believe in Wallace's guilt point to the impossibility of anyone else committing the crime. No forced entry, no credible alternative suspect, an alibi so elaborate it must be fabricated. Those who believe in his innocence point to the equal impossibility of Wallace himself committing the crime within the time frame available. The missing weapon, the lack of blood evidence on his person or clothing. Both sides marshal logic and evidence, yet both arguments lead to conclusions that strain credulity. The newspapers fuel the fire with increasingly sensational coverage. The Daily Express runs the headline "The Impossible Murder," with a diagram attempting to explain how Wallace could have killed Julia, cleaned up, and caught his tram in the narrow window available. The calculations are complex, requiring Wallace to have moved with inhuman speed and efficiency. The Manchester Guardian publishes an opposing editorial titled "Rush to Judgment," arguing that convicting a man based on suspicious circumstances rather than concrete evidence sets a dangerous precedent. Public meetings are held. Petitions circulate. The case becomes more than murder. It becomes a referendum on the justice system itself. The appeal hearing opens on May 18th before the Court of Criminal Appeal, consisting of the Lord Chief Justice, Mr. Justice Branson, and Mr. Justice Hawke. Wallace's legal team, bolstered by the prominent barrister Roland Oliver, presents 3 principal grounds for appeal. First, that the verdict was against the weight of evidence. Second, that Mr. Justice Wright misdirected the jury on crucial points of law. Third, that the prosecution failed to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Wallace could have committed the murder within the established timeline. Oliver's presentation is masterful, systematically dismantling the prosecution's case brick by brick. He begins with the telephone call, producing new evidence that casts doubt on the prosecution's theory that Wallace made it himself. Investigators have retimed the walk from the call box to the chess club under various conditions, in darkness, at different paces, with and without stops. The minimum time, even at a near run, is 14 minutes. The maximum is 20. Wallace would have had to leave the call box at 7:15 p.m. and arrive at the chess club no later than 7:35 p.m., a 20-minute window requiring sustained rapid walking through dark streets in winter. Possible, yes. But why would a man planning murder draw potential attention to himself by rushing? Moreover, Oliver produces testimony from a telephone exchange operator who recalls technical difficulties with the line that evening. The connection was poor, requiring the caller to speak loudly and clearly. Multiple witnesses at the chess club recalled Wallace's voice that evening as perfectly normal. No strain, no breathlessness, no indication he just completed a rapid walk through cold air. "My lord," Oliver argues, "we are asked to believe Mr. Wallace is not merely a murderer, but a man of such extraordinary physical conditioning and self-control that he can complete a journey requiring great haste without showing any effects. Does this sound credible?" The timeline of the murder itself receives even more devastating scrutiny. Oliver presents a minute-by-minute reconstruction. Wallace left his house at 6:45 p.m., witnessed by neighbors. He caught the tram at 7:06 p.m., confirmed by the conductor. That provides a 21-minute window. But Professor McFall estimated death at approximately 6 p.m., with a margin of error of 30 minutes. Under cross-examination during trial, McFall admitted death could have occurred as late as 6:30 p.m., possibly even 6:45 p.m. if the room temperature was elevated by the gas fire. "But my lords," Oliver continues, "even accepting the latest possible time of death at 6:45 p.m., consider what Mr. Wallace would have had to accomplish in virtually no time at all. He would have needed to murder his wife with 11 violent blows, a frenzied attack that would have covered him with blood. He would have needed to remove his blood-soaked clothing, wash himself thoroughly enough to eliminate all traces of blood, redress in clean clothes, hide or dispose of the murder weapon, stage the crime scene with the Macintosh and the opened cabinet, compose himself sufficiently to appear normal, and walk to the tram stop, all in 0 minutes. Because the murder occurred, by this timeline, at the very moment he walked out the door." Oliver pauses, letting the impossibility sink in. The prosecution cannot have it both ways. Either Julia Wallace died before her husband left the house, in which case he would have had time to clean up but would have been covered in blood when witnesses saw him departing, or she died after he left, in which case he couldn't have killed her. There is no middle ground that supports the conviction. The missing weapon becomes Oliver's next target. Extensive police searches found nothing. The drains were searched. The gardens along Wolverton Street were combed. The route Wallace took to the tram was examined. If Wallace disposed of the weapon, he did so with such thoroughness that it defied discovery. My lords, we are asked to believe that Mr. Wallace, in his narrow window of time, not only committed murder and cleaned himself, but also disposed of a weapon so effectively that the combined resources of the Liverpool City Police cannot locate it. Where is this weapon? What was it? How did Wallace dispose of it without being seen by the multiple neighbors who witnessed his departure? The blood evidence, or rather, the lack of it, proves equally problematic for the prosecution's theory. The attack on Julia was savage, producing extensive arterial spray. The killer would have been drenched in blood, yet no blood was found on Wallace's clothing, in the bathroom, on any of the towels, or anywhere else in the house except the parlor where Julia died. The prosecution suggested Wallace change clothes, but the dirty laundry basket contained nothing blood-stained. They suggested he washed, but the bathroom showed no signs of recent vigorous cleaning. They suggested he wore the Macintosh found under Julia's body as protection, but expert testimony confirmed the Macintosh showed burn marks from the gas fire and blood patterns inconsistent with being worn during the attack. Oliver's final argument addresses the question of motive, or the lack thereof. The prosecution suggests financial gain and freedom from an unhappy marriage. Yet the financial gain was negligible, £4 allegedly stolen, a modest insurance policy that barely covered funeral expenses. As for the marriage being unhappy, every witness who knew the couple described them as content, if not passionate. They were late-life partners who lived quietly, routinely, without drama. Where's the evidence of a marriage so miserable that murder became preferable to divorce or simple separation? The Lord Chief Justice interrupts. Mr. Oliver, are you suggesting that unless we can identify an alternative suspect, the conviction must stand? Oliver meets his gaze directly. My lord, I am suggesting that the burden of proof rests with the prosecution. They must prove Mr. Wallace committed this crime beyond reasonable doubt. They have failed to do so. The evidence is entirely circumstantial. The timeline is impossible. The method is unexplained. The weapon is missing. The motive is weak. A conviction cannot rest on the absence of alternatives. It must rest on proof of guilt, and that proof simply does not exist. The prosecution's response, delivered by Edward Hemmard with his customary theatrical flair, attempts to reframe the impossibilities as evidence of Wallace's criminal genius. My lords, the defense asks how Wallace could have done it. I ask instead, who else could have done it? Who else made that telephone call? Who else knew Wallace would be absent from his home? Who else could have gained entry without forcing doors or windows? Julia Wallace was a cautious woman, frail and careful. She would not have admitted a stranger. Yet she was murdered in her own parlor, her back turned to her killer, suggesting complete trust. Who did she trust absolutely? Her husband, who benefited from her death, however modestly. Her husband, who created an elaborate alibi involving dozens of witnesses. Her husband. Herbert acknowledges the timeline difficulties, but argues they prove calculation rather than innocence. Yes, the time frame is tight. Yes, the cleanup would have required speed. Yes, the disposal of the weapon would have needed planning. But consider the alternative, that someone else, some phantom killer, chose this exact night, this exact narrow window when Wallace was provably absent, to murder Julia Wallace for no apparent reason, leaving no trace, no evidence, no clue to their identity. Which is more probable? That Wallace executed a brilliant but flawed plan, or that he is the victim of the most extraordinary coincidence in criminal history? The Court of Criminal Appeal retires to deliberate. 3 days pass. Wallace remains in his cell, his execution now postponed pending the appeal decision. On May 19th, the court reconvenes. The courtroom is even more packed than during the original trial. Spectators and journalists crammed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with anticipation and tension. The Lord Chief Justice delivers the judgment, and his words will echo through British legal history for decades. This court has considered carefully all aspects of this case. We are not satisfied that the evidence supports the conviction. The case against Wallace is entirely circumstantial. While circumstances can certainly prove guilt, they must do so beyond reasonable doubt. In this case, the Crown has failed to eliminate reasonable doubt. He continues, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority, but also a note of profound unease. We find the timeline of the murder to be problematic. We find the lack of physical evidence troubling. We find the absence of the murder weapon significant. Most importantly, we find that the jury's verdict, while understandable given the suspicious circumstances, cannot stand when measured against the strict requirements of English law. The conviction is quashed. Mr. Wallace is free to go. The courtroom erupts. Cheers from Wallace's supporters. Shouts of outrage from those convinced of his guilt. Journalists sprint for telephones. Wallace himself, standing in the dock, shows the most emotion he's displayed throughout the entire ordeal. His eyes close briefly. His hands tremble. His controlled facade finally cracking to reveal something that might be relief, or might be vindication, or might be simple exhaustion. But the Lord Chief Justice isn't finished. His final words carry an ominous qualification that will haunt Wallace for the rest of his life. We do not say that Mr. Wallace is innocent. We say only that the evidence is insufficient to convict him. The question of his guilt or innocence remains, in the judgment of this court, an open one. It's a Pyrrhic victory. Wallace is freed, but not exonerated. The conviction is overturned, but the suspicion remains. He walks out of the Court of Criminal Appeal a free man in legal terms, but in practical terms, he's stepping into a prison of public opinion that will confine him until his death. The newspapers trumpet the decision with competing headlines. Wallace freed, justice prevailed proclaims one. Murderer escapes gallows on technicality, screams another. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the murky middle, in that space where evidence and certainty fail to meet, where the impossible and the improbable fight for dominance, and where a man can be simultaneously guilty and innocent depending on which impossibility one chooses to believe. William Herbert Wallace returns to 29 Wolverton Street, to the house where his wife was murdered, where blood-stains still mark the parlor walls, where neighbors whisper and children dare each other to approach the door. He's free, but he's also trapped by suspicion, by mystery, by the unanswered questions that will follow him like ghosts until his own death 2 years later from kidney disease, the same ailment that plagued Julia. And the question that launched this nightmare remains unanswered. Who was R.M. Qualtrough? The phantom caller who set everything in motion, who summoned Wallace away from his home, who created the perfect opportunity for murder while simultaneously creating the perfect defense against it. Was Qualtrough Wallace himself, a split personality, A fictional construct designed to be Wallace's alibi? Or was Qualtrough someone else entirely? A real person with real motives who used Wallace as an unwitting accomplice in the perfect murder? The court has spoken. Wallace is free. But freedom, in this case, is just another form of sentence. William Herbert Wallace walks out of Walton Prison on May 19, 1931, a free man in name only. The crowd gathered outside the gates parts for him, some faces showing sympathy, others naked hostility. A woman spits at his feet. A man calls out murderer. Others applaud cautiously, unsure if they're cheering for justice or enabling a killer. Wallace walks through this gauntlet of judgment with the same measured composure that has defined him throughout this ordeal, his face revealing nothing, his pace steady. He's 52 years old and looks 70, aged by months of imprisonment and the weight of suspicion that will never fully lift. He returns to 29, Wolverton Street, because he has nowhere else to go. The house that was his home has become a macabre tourist attraction. Strangers walk slowly past, pointing, whispering, taking photographs. Children dare each other to touch the front gate. Someone has scrawled murderer in white paint on the brick wall, the letters crude but indelible. Wallace scrubs at them for hours, but can never quite remove the ghost of the accusation. The blood stains in the parlor, despite professional cleaning, remain faintly visible in certain light. A Rorschach test in brown asking the eternal question, who killed Julia Wallace? The Prudential Insurance Company, eager to distance itself from the scandal, terminates Wallace's employment. No official reason is given, none is needed. Who would buy insurance from a man acquitted of murdering his wife only because the evidence was deemed insufficient? Wallace's savings dwindle. He takes odd jobs, clerical work, anything that doesn't require public interaction. His former colleagues from the chess club treat him with polite distance, the way one might treat a leper, sympathetic perhaps, but unwilling to risk contamination by association. The isolation drives Wallace to write. In 1932, he publishes a short book titled The Man from the Peru, a defensive, self-justifying account of the case from his perspective. It sells moderately well, purchased mostly by the morbidly curious, hoping to glean confession between the lines. They're disappointed. Wallace maintains his innocence with the same methodical insistence, presenting his case as a mathematical proof, breaking down timelines and evidence with analytical precision. But cold logic cannot overcome the emotional certainty of those convinced of his guilt. The book convinces no one who wasn't already convinced. In the text, Wallace offers his own theory about the mysterious Qualtrough. He suggests it might have been someone with a grudge against him, or a criminal who had somehow learned Wallace's routine and saw an opportunity. But even Wallace admits his theories are speculative, unsupported by evidence. The phantom caller remains exactly that, a phantom, dissolving into mist whenever examined too closely. Wallace's inability to identify Qualtrough feels less like the frustration of an innocent victim and more like the careful vagueness of a guilty man protecting his fiction. On February 26, 1933, less than 2 years after his acquittal, William Herbert Wallace dies of kidney disease in Clatterbridge Hospital. He's 54 years old. His death is noted briefly in the newspapers, Wallace of murder case dead, but without the sensationalism that accompanied his trial. In death, as in life, he remains an enigma. His final words, reported by an attending nurse, are mundane. "My wife is waiting for me." Some interpret this as the statement of an innocent man looking forward to reunion in whatever afterlife awaits. Others hear it as the delusion of a guilty conscience, believing Julia waits not in heaven, but as an eternal accuser. Wallace's death closes the human chapter of the case, but the mystery itself remains vibrantly, frustratingly alive. Over the decades that follow, the Wallace case becomes an obsession for amateur detectives, true crime enthusiasts, and legal scholars. More books are written about this single murder than about most serial killers. Everyone has a theory. No one has proof. The most prominent theory, advanced by multiple investigators over the years, suggests Wallace planned and executed the murder himself with meticulous precision. According to this interpretation, Wallace made the telephone call on January 19th, using a disguised voice, then rushed to the chess club to establish he was elsewhere when the message was delivered. The next evening, he murdered Julia shortly before leaving the house, perhaps as late as 6:40 p.m., giving himself barely enough time to clean up superficially before departing. The blood-soaked clothing was hidden somewhere in the house, or disposed of later. The murder weapon was carried away during one of his subsequent visits home and disposed of at leisure. The elaborate journey across Liverpool searching for the non-existent address was theater, designed to create dozens of witnesses to his confusion and frustration. Wallace knew the address didn't exist. He'd invented it precisely for this purpose. Every person he asked for directions, every shopkeeper he consulted, every moment of documented searching was a brick in the wall of his alibi. And when he returned home, he discovered Julia's body with the Johnstons present to witness his reaction. It's brilliant, calculating, and utterly ruthless. It's also consistent with Wallace's methodical personality and his demonstrated ability to remain calm under extraordinary pressure. But this theory requires accepting several improbabilities. Wallace would have needed to murder his wife, clean himself sufficiently to pass casual inspection, hide or carry away the weapon, and reach the tram stop all within the narrowest possible time frame. Even allowing for the latest possible time of death, the window is perhaps 15 to 20 minutes at most. It's possible, but only just. And it requires Wallace to have been not merely clever, but almost preternaturally controlled, able to commit savage violence, and then immediately present a normal appearance to strangers. An alternative theory, proposed by crime historian Jonathan Goodman and others, suggests Wallace was innocent and Julia was killed by someone who knew the household intimately. Possibly someone who had been in the house before, knew the layout, and knew where the cash box was kept. This person made the telephone call to lure Wallace away, then gained entry to the house through Julia's trust. The killer might have been a friend, a relative, or even someone from the insurance company with whom Julia was familiar. After the murder, this person vanished into the anonymity of 1931 Liverpool, their motive dying with them. This theory explains the lack of forced entry and Julia's apparent willingness to admit her killer. It explains why she was in the rarely used parlor. She was entertaining a visitor. It explains the staged quality of the crime scene, an opportunistic criminal attempting to disguise murder as robbery. But it fails to explain the extraordinary coincidence of timing. What are the odds that someone would choose this specific night, the one night Wallace was provably absent due to a mysterious telephone call, to murder Julia? The coincidence strains credulity almost as much as Wallace's guilt does. A third theory, more disturbing in its implications, suggests that Wallace and an accomplice worked together. Perhaps Wallace had a lover, someone who stood to benefit from Julia's death. Wallace created his alibi while the accomplice committed the actual murder. This would explain both the impossible timeline and the inside knowledge of the household. But no accomplice was ever identified. Wallace's life was investigated exhaustively. His finances, his correspondence, his social connections. If he had a lover or partner in crime, they left no trace whatsoever. And keeping such a secret for decades, through imprisonment and trial and public scrutiny, requires a level of loyalty and discretion that seems as improbable as Wallace committing the murder alone. In 1981, 50 years after Julia's death, a radio engineer named Roger Wilkes published a comprehensive book titled Wallace, The Final Verdict. Wilkes spent years researching the case, examining every document, interviewing surviving witnesses, consulting forensic experts. His conclusion, backed by circumstantial analysis and psychological profiling, was that Wallace was guilty. Wilkes argued that Wallace's personality, cold, calculating, obsessed with logic and systems, fit the profile of someone capable of planning and executing such a crime. The book is persuasive, meticulous, and utterly inconclusive, because after 500 pages of analysis, Wilkes admits he cannot prove how Wallace did it, only that he likely did. In 1998, crime author James Murphy published a rebuttal titled The Murder of Julia Wallace, The True Story. Murphy argued for Wallace's innocence, suggesting that the prosecution and subsequent investigators suffered from confirmation bias, interpreting every ambiguous fact as evidence of guilt. Murphy's book is equally persuasive, equally meticulous, and equally inconclusive. The case has become a Rorschach test. People see in it what they're predisposed to see, finding evidence for whatever conclusion they've already reached. Modern forensic analysis, applied retrospectively to the case, offers frustratingly little clarity. Blood spatter experts suggest the killer must have been covered in blood, but acknowledge that protective clothing could explain the lack of transfer evidence. Timeline analysts confirm that Wallace could theoretically have committed the murder, but only if everything went perfectly with no delays or complications. Psychological profilers are divided. Some see Wallace's calm demeanor as evidence of psychopathy, others as the natural response of an introverted personality under stress. The telephone call remains the most tantalizing piece of evidence. In 2001, a voice analysis expert attempted to compare recordings of Wallace's voice from a later radio interview with descriptions of the Qualtrough caller's voice. The analysis was inconclusive. The available recordings were of insufficient quality, and witness memories of a voice from 70 years prior are notoriously unreliable. But the expert noted that Wallace's voice had a distinctive quality that would be difficult to fully disguise, even with deliberate alteration. If he made the call, witnesses at the chess club should have recognized something familiar in the voice when Beatty read back the message. No one did. The location of the telephone box is telling. 400 yards from Wallace's home, far enough to suggest someone else could have made the call, close enough that Wallace could have reached it quickly. But why would Wallace choose a call box so close to his home? If planning murder, wouldn't he have called from somewhere more distant, somewhere that couldn't be connected to him? Unless, and this is the kind of metathinking that makes the case so maddening, Wallace deliberately chose a nearby call box precisely because it seemed too obvious, too risky, something a guilty man wouldn't do. The layers of deception and counter-deception spiral infinitely inward. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Wallace case is that it represents a perfect storm of ambiguity. Every piece of evidence admits to multiple interpretations. Every timeline calculation has margins of error. Every witness statement contains uncertainties. The case sits at the precise point where suspicion and proof fail to converge, where the impossible and the improbable meet and cancel each other out. It's as if the universe conspired to create a murder mystery that cannot, by its very nature, be solved with certainty. The house at 29 Wolverton Street was demolished in 1960, replaced by modern housing. The street still exists, but the exact location of the Wallace home is now a small garden, anonymous and unmarked. Julia has no memorial except the case files and the endless books rehashing her death. Wallace left no descendants, no legacy except the mystery itself. The Prudential Insurance Company no longer keeps records from 1931. The telephone exchange records are long gone. The physical evidence, the bloodstained rug, the Macintosh, the cabinet, were destroyed decades ago. All that remains is the story, told and retold, analyzed and reanalyzed. Each generation of crime enthusiasts convinced they can solve what previous generations could not. But perhaps the Wallace case isn't meant to be solved. Perhaps it serves a different purpose, as a reminder of the limits of certainty, of the spaces where evidence ends and faith begins, of the uncomfortable truth that justice sometimes requires choosing between competing impossibilities. The jury in 1931 chose to believe Wallace was guilty despite the timeline problems. The Court of Appeal chose to believe the evidence was insufficient despite the suspicious circumstances. Both decisions were defensible. Both might be wrong. In the end, the murder of Julia Wallace stands as the perfect unsolvable crime, not because the evidence was destroyed or the investigation was bungled, but because the case itself exists in a state of quantum uncertainty, simultaneously supporting guilt and innocence, depending on which impossibility one chooses to embrace. William Herbert Wallace may have been a murderer who committed the perfect crime marred only by a too-perfect alibi. Or he may have been an innocent man, destroyed by the most extraordinary coincidence in criminal history. The evidence supports both conclusions equally. The clock that ticked on that January night in 1931 has long since stopped. But the mystery it measured continues to tick in the minds of everyone who encounters this case, each person forced to confront the uncomfortable question. What do you do when the evidence points everywhere and nowhere simultaneously? When the most logical conclusion is that logic itself has failed? What's your take on this case? Did Wallace orchestrate his wife's murder with cold precision? Or was he the victim of timing so tragically perfect it incriminated him? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking, and some cases refuse to close no matter how many years pass. Julia Wallace's murder remains officially unsolved. The phantom caller named Qualtrough was never identified. The murder weapon was never found. And in the archives of British legal history, the case file sits permanently marked with the most frustrating of all designations: insufficient evidence to determine. Nearly a century has passed since that cold January night when 11 blows shattered Julia Wallace's skull and created a mystery that has outlived everyone involved. The truth died with Wallace in 1933, if he knew it. Or perhaps it died with Qualtrough, whoever that was, wherever they went. Or perhaps, most disturbing of all, the truth doesn't exist in any form we can recognize, because this case was never meant to make sense, only to demonstrate that sometimes reality constructs puzzles with pieces that simply don't fit, no matter how carefully we arrange them. The murder of Julia Wallace, the impossible alibi. Impossible indeed. Not because we cannot solve it, but because every solution requires believing in impossibilities. And in that requirement lies the case's eternal, maddening fascination. The mystery endures. The questions remain. And somewhere in the space between certainty and doubt, Julia Wallace still waits for the justice that may never come, and William Herbert Wallace still protests an innocence that may never be believed. The clock has stopped, but time itself refuses to let this case rest.